Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and over the last few weeks in the War Within beta, we've seen a ton of different class buffs, with so many different playstyles becoming even more popular, stronger, and better over the last few weeks of development. From arcane mages and fire mages, which continue to get love every single week, to the hunters, which continue to get even more updates and even more popularity for the spec of survival, death knights, and even shamans, which have been the most recent recipient of some adjustments and tuning, with elemental becoming quite a popular pick as of recently, though out of all the different class specs in the game, Druid is the one that actually I feel like has gotten the most amount of updates over these last few weeks. And when you take a look at the entire list of changes they've gotten, it's pretty massive. From base damage increases for a huge portion of the talents, as well as basic abilities and procs, to so many different amplifiers for talents that have been recently added, though I haven't seen nearly as much play as they were hoping they would, as well as adjustments for some of the hero talents in order to make sure the boomkins have plenty of options to pick from when it comes to endgame content of this next expansion. And this list of changes surprisingly is quite massive, and I feel like it's been a good second since we really talked about druids over on the channel. So for today's video, I want to take a look at a cumulative set of changes that have happened to balance druids just over the last few weeks over on the beta, and go over every single way that that spec has improved and how it feels to play so far over on the beta. As always, if you guys enjoy regular class updates like these over on the War Within, be sure to follow the channel. Otherwise, let's dive right in. It's been a hot second since we actually covered some druid stuff on the channel, and I'm kind of going to go over all of the couple of things that have happened over the last few weeks, because we have seen some actually big shifts for druid just for one spec in particular. But before that, we did have some hero talent adjustments for a handful of them, starting with Elun's Chosen, Keeper of the Grove, and a little bit for Wild Stalker. Elun's Chosen, which I actually picked up and started playing with a little bit more just to explore it a little bit deeper, have gotten a couple of adjustments. Like, for example, Boundless Moonlight damage for both Fury of Elune as well as Full Moon all have been amplified by, it looks like, 25%, which is sizable. The Minor Moons available for Fury of Elune's damage has also been increased by 110%, which is noticeable. The talent that gives you a very interesting boomkin playstyle that really has you lean into like the very flavor of Elun's Chosen is called Lunar Calling. What this talent does is it essentially locks you out of being able to have a solar eclipse. It just allows you to use lunar eclipses, because you can see there's no number next to my Starfire, and no matter how much I spam Starfire, I'm never going to be able to get into a solar eclipse ever. It's just not happening. But if I were to press Wrath a couple of times, it gives me Lunar Eclipse. Lunar Eclipse is primarily there to mostly buff your AoE damage, but with this talent, it actually allows you to fully lean into that whole flavor of being a lunar druid with Lunar Calling, where Starfire will deal 62% increased damage to your primary target, but no longer trigger solar eclipse. This 62% number is their newest value. I don't remember exactly what it was, but the new value amps up the Starfire damage by 65, and I've been playing around with this talent. I think it's maybe an okay choice in pure AoE and M+ situations. I like it for the flavor of being like a full-on lunar druid. I just don't know if it's any good, but that is one of the buffs that has been done recently. Lunar Insight is another one that's actually got buffed up recently. Lunar Insight now will increase Moonfire damage by 20% instead of 10. That one hasn't made it into a hotfix yet, but it looks like parts of these have been hotfixed little by little. But this one is supposed to be 20% instead of 10%, which is quite a sizable gain for both Bear and Boomkin. And Atmospheric Exposure, which basically causes enemies to take additional damage from your abilities whenever they get hit by Full Moon, Fury of Elune, or the Mastery Lunar Beam, I think it is, for Guardian Druid. The enemies take now 6% increased damage, I believe, instead of 5%. So this one has been hotfixed as of recently, which does make Elun's Chosen a little bit better for Boomkin in particular, I think. It does make it a little bit better for, I guess, Guardian also. But I've been seeing a lot of Guardians running around with Elun's Chosen, so this makes me believe that this is more a balance adjustment more than anything. As for Keeper of the Grove, they did a couple of adjustments here and there, but the most important one recently is Bounteous Bloom. This one has been adjusted, so now it generates 7 astral power instead of 6. Keeper of the Grove is generally solid. It's very cooldown based and cooldown heavy, not as flavorful as the Line's Chosen, but has generally been the more playable option, or the more popular option that I see being played amongst Boomkin kind. Now, another set of hero talents that got adjusted has been for the Wild Stalker, which it looks like I had it set up for Restoration, but not for Feral. As for the Wild Stalker, it seems to be the more popular pick amongst Ferals and Restoration Druids, and it's actually seen quite a sizable amount of updates. Thriving Grow, for example, basically allows you to rip and rake your bleeds to grow a Bloodseeker vine that adds an extra bleed over 6 seconds, while Wild Growth and Regrowth healing has a chance to grow a Symbiotic Bloom that heals over a handful of seconds. So the proc rate for this one has been actually reduced to be 15% less frequent, which may actually make it quite a significant change. The capstone of Vigorous Creepers has also been adjusted where it actually increases the damage done to enemies, where let's say Bloodseeker Vines on enemies cause them to take 6% more damage from you. Allies with Symbiotic Bloom take 6% more healing. That has been adjusted from 6% to 5%. Again, another way just to reduce the popularity of Wild Stalker. And for the trait of Bursting Growth, which gives you a bit more of this instantaneous effect on like your Ferocious Bites as a Feral, or the healing effect as a Resto, that one has been adjusted to have its damage reduced by 15%, which again, it seems like they're really going after the Wild Stalker. It is a very passive hero talent, but some of the more passive hero talents have generally been some of the more effective ones too. Like between Wild Stalker, the, I guess, Spellslinger Mage, which is mostly passive for majority of it, as well as the Sentinel Hunter. I think all of them are pretty passive for the most part too, aren't they? Yeah, it seems that even though some of the less exciting ones, more boring ones are generally the stronger ones, so it's good that at least there's some adjustment going in that direction. But as for the actual Druid changes, we don't see too many spec changes. We have seen some slight adjustments in the class challenge tree, which are mostly convenience based rather than anything, but it does, I guess, make it a little bit easier for you to shuffle around your talent points. For example, one of the more popular talents, which is Fluid Form, has been shifted towards the bottom center of the talent tree, which a lot of druids like, especially if you play hybrid builds. With this one, Shred and Rake will instantly shift you into cat form, Mangle can instantly shift you into bear form, and casting Wrath and Starfire will shift you into Minka form if you have access to that ability. This one initially was over here, so it kind of caused you to be basically required to put 2 points into Lore of the Grove in order to pick up a point to Fluid Form. But putting it down the middle, I think most druids will end up picking up at least Lakara's Teachings, and that's just an extra talent point that you can invest into from here on. Another one that got adjusted was Stampeding Roar, which was a lot higher in the talent tree, and essentially it allowed you to pick up improved Stampeding Roar without putting a point into Stampeding Roar. So they've adjusted it so you can't have one without the other, which is a good change. It was kind of silly that you could do that. Pick one without the other, but for the most part, I think Fluid Form change is also really, really good. The rest of the changes are primarily going to highlight the spec of Boomkin, and the Feathery Bird spec has gone through a ton of changes as of recently. For example, I guess I'm just going to go through all of them. There's a lot of damage adjustments, in fact. Not really nerfs, I'd say mostly buffs, but also a ton of wild talent changes like Astral Smolder, which has gone from a 2 talent point cost to a single talent point cost. So it refunds you an extra talent point to spend however you want to. With this one, they also changed it so that the proc rate decreased from 45 to 40%, but the damage of Wrath and Starfire increased from 40 to 50%, which hasn't fully set in just yet. They did reduce the cost of it, which is really, really good, but the damage values, not all of them have been adjusted recently, but it is a nice convenience because it seems to be a very popular talent, especially if you play with someone like Waning Twilight, which is quite often picked. Certain talents such as Stellar Amplification are getting some love as well, with Stellar Amplification having its damage increased to 20% up from 15%, and you can see that this one actually did make its way through hotfixes already. As well as the talent of Umbral Intensity, which has seen an increase to the damage bonus for Wrath and Starfire by 25 and 50% instead of by 20 and 40%. So the more points you put into it, the more value you get out of this ability. With the talent of Umbral Inspiration, the duration of this buff has been increased to 6 seconds, and the damage bonus increased from 20% to 30%. So it seems that they're going after all of the newer talents like Umbral Inspiration as well as Amplification, or anything that isn't as often picked, in order to help fortify them a little bit better. With the talent of Orbit Breaker, they actually reduce the amount of shooting stars procs you need to get in order to call in a full moon, dropping it from 30 shooting stars down to 25, which is a nice improvement. And for Sundered Firmament, they actually have allowed a stronger Fury of Elune to be called down to be 25% effective instead of 20% effective, so it's another bonus there. And Convoke the Spirits has had a really much needed adjustment that probably should have happened a while ago. So Convoke as an ability kind of fires off your spells, your spec specific abilities, a little bit wildly. It can pick targets kind of at random. What they've adjusted for this ability is for certain spells such as your Full Moon and Star Surge, Convoke as a boomkin will likely try to cast more Star Surges than before. So you will hopefully end up seeing a little bit more Star Surge procs every single time you use Convoke as an ability. So hopefully that'll make it a bit more consistent and allows you to utilize some of the talents that play around the Star Surge ability generally. But also both Full Moon as well as Star Surge are more likely, very much more likely, to target your primary target with both of these abilities. Previously, Full Moon would just kind of pick a random target, same with Star Surge, and sometimes you would end up sending Star Surges and Full Moons at targets you didn't necessarily want to be attacking. So the more targets you had, the more opportunity it was for Convoke to just pick a random target and have a random oopsie. Where if, let's say, you wanted to focus a boss that has a shield that needs to be burned, otherwise everybody dies, let's say just making up a mechanic on the spot here, you needed that Convoke to really funnel into the boss, so you had to do some very clever positioning kind of off in a corner so there's no more targets, so Convoke can only hit one single target. So no longer will you have to do that. This makes the ability a little bit more consistent. I gotta try this one in dungeons. It does seem a little bit better. It doesn't seem to be as random, and I think this is going to be a pretty big buff for Druids when it comes to PvP, making Convoke a bit less random and a little bit more focused. Though with buffs, we also did see a couple of nerfs, and seems to be nerfs to some of the more popular talents, such as Wild Surges, which has had its critical strike chance reduced for Wrath and Starfire from 12% down to 10%. Umbral Embrace has also been adjusted as well. Umbral base damage bonus reduced to 75% instead of 100%, as well as Power of the Gauldron, a very, very powerful and a very popular talent, has had its damage reduced by 10%. However, with nerfs also came a ton of buffs a couple of weeks ago. Initially, Blizzard ended up buffing the damage of all boomkins by about 5%, and then they reduced it back down by 5%, so those two canceled each other out. Though there's still a flurry of a bunch of other boomkin buffs in particular that are still in the game as of right now, such as the talent of Orbital Strike, which has been buffed by 25%, and you really do feel the damage of it every time you use it in AoE. Shooting Stars damage has also been amplified by 10%, which is, I think, is a bonus overall, even though Shooting Stars generally ends up being kind of a portion of your damage, not a huge portion. But then basic combat abilities such as Star Surge, Starfall, and even Fury of Elune, as well as your New Moon, Half Moon, Full Moon, all have been amplified by 15% on top of it, which is very, very noticeable when you combine it together with Elune's Chosen and all the different damage buffs and cooldown reduction that you could do when it comes to your Fury of Elune, for example. Talents such as Denizen of the Dream as well as Stellar Flare has had their damage buffed by roughly 10-ish%, and with the talent of Greater Alignment, which changes the way that your Celestial Alignment or Incarnation functions, usually making it last longer and amplifying those lunar and nature eclipses during the alignment or incarnation. The damage bonus for each eclipse has actually been amplified from 5% to 8%, which allows you kind of like a very, very powerful 3-minute window with your Celestial Alignment or Incarnation being a very, very powerful ability with the most amount of punchiness and impact, or you can go for a shorter cooldown reduction with a little bit more of this like beam that kind of cuts through a bunch of enemies, applying Stellar Flare for free, which all in all together does give boomkins quite a bit of a damage buff. This is something that I've really been trying to do with a ton of classes recently, and I think boomkins were one of those classes that were hit as part of this adjustment. A lot of classes in WoW, at least in Dragonflight, are very burst focused, cooldown focused rather. Like their impact inside of CDs very, very high, but that creates a big peak and a valley. During their burst, the highest amount of impact they could have, and then outside of cooldowns, it's just kind of mediocre, which results in a big value of damage up until cooldowns are back up. They've really been trying to kind of cut down on the amount of peaks and valleys by giving classes a little bit more amp in terms of their basic rotational buttons, while still keeping their cooldowns fairly powerful, but having that rotation outside of cooldowns be still meaningful, and that contribution of damage that you can do outside of CDs to still be good, because otherwise classes then have to really synergize the cooldowns during very specific windows, or get buffs such as PI, or really line everything up with Bloodlust, or in Mythic Pluses, for example, have a really big pull in order to have their cooldowns have any kind of meaning, which in some Mythic Plus situations, this just seems like the way that Blizzard has been designing dungeons. They know the players are going to want to go for big pulls and trying to save as much time as they can. They would prefer for players to have more smaller but efficient pulls, though that's just not how the game is. But they are trying to give classes a little bit more damage outside of cooldown so they can still be that impact that a player can feel instead of feeling like the meandering up until cooldowns are up. And balanced druids are definitely trying to be fed as much as possible. Now, Boomkin is a spec that I don't normally play that often, and it's just, it's kind of like Beastmaster Hunter. It is neat and there's some cool interactions, but I've never really found it compelling enough in order to like really get into it. I'd much rather play Feral Druid or Bear or Restoration, or like with Beastmaster Hunter, I'd rather play Survival. I think there's like some cool intricate things and some difficulties of playing those specs, but it's just fun to play something that's rough. Boomkin actually was a main for me when I first started playing WoW. And the Eclipse mechanic back in the day was actually one of my favorites, as well as the way you could grow mushrooms and have them explode and have this more bursty rather than dot playstyle that they have now. Since then, I feel like they've kind of made Boomkin, I feel like over the last few expansions, easier to approach, which isn't a bad thing. It just hasn't really been my favorite. But playing it out and recently, especially with Elune's Chosen and trying some of the more flavor picks, such as Lunar Calling, as well as playing for cooldown reduction for Illumination, for example, and playing around the Eternal Moon, I actually really like it. It's a very powerful playstyle. It isn't complicated, it doesn't really need to be, but it is a very effective and a powerful playstyle with a ton of mobility, and with all these different druid hybrid tools, I feel like there's a lot more ways for you to feel even tankier than before, like timing that bear form during a very big hit, or having all these useful utility abilities here and there. I really did end up appreciating it. I don't really know if this is going to still be one of my favorites, but for many players, Balanced Druid is one of the best options. And that's one of their favorite playstyles in general, just because of the way that it performs in PvE content. And I think it's actually looking quite powerful so far from my time spent with the spec. I've been enjoying exploring Keeper of the Grove and Elune's Chosen, and I really like Elune's Chosen in particular. I definitely would give this one a go if you're on a beta. Keeper of the Grove didn't see too many changes, but it also just seems like a cooldown, but it doesn't really change your playstyle too much. Though Elune's Chosen, I feel like there's some cool flavorful options that I actually would really like to experiment some more with over the next few weeks. But with that being said, who really cares what I think about the Balanced Druid? I want to hear your thoughts about Druids down below. What are your thoughts on all the different changes for Boomkin, as well as some of the hero talents? But also, what other Druid changes would you want to see? You'll notice that specs such as Feral Druid have gotten some changes, but not a crazy amount. Restoration has gotten some cooldown adjustments, but they haven't really seen an update in a bit. And Guardian Druids, I don't think changed at all, except for how they've added and adjusted some of their hero talents. There may have been some spec changes specifically in their spec tree in order to adjust the way talents are, but for the most part, it just feels like they haven't got any changes. So it seems a lot of effort has been put into Boomkins. But I want to ask you guys in the comments down below, do you think the Guardian, Feral, or Resto probably need nearly this many updates as well? Like, should they get one just like Boomkins have? Or do you think they're fine as is? I want to hear you guys' thoughts in the comments down below. As per usual, if you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I would very much appreciate it. And as always, in the description of every single video and live stream, we have a link to our Discord community channel. Probably the best place to reach out to me directly in case you want to let me know what you thought about this video, or hang out with the rest of the community to discuss some of the upcoming changes. Join our Discord to become part of the community. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.